You know, one of my troubles this morning was all the readings this morning were really wonderful. The reading from Job is great. The reading from 2 Corinthians is great. Of course, that gospel lesson is just, you know, full of wonder material. But since Travis told me that I had to confine the sermon to an hour and a half, I decided that I would only focus on one reading. I think I'll be able to get this in an hour, maybe even an hour and 20 minutes. So that's actually less. I want us to think this morning about the reading from Job, and to see what the Lord might want to have to say to us. Have you ever wanted to ask God a particularly burning or perhaps even desperate question? Maybe there was that time that you wanted to ask Him why it is that He seems to allow evil to operate so freely in the world. Why is it that some people go through a whole life of suffering, whereas other people seem to go through life without hardly any difficulties at all? And why is it that sometimes it seems that God is so absent from the world? Or at least, why isn't He more dramatically present in it? Why is it that life seems sometimes to be so unfair? And why doesn't God simply say the word and make evil and sin vanish from the world instantaneously? Abracadabra, alakazam, sin be gone, wham, 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 gone. Why did that woman have a miscarriage? And why did that man get terminal cancer? If God is so good, why is it that the world seems sometimes like a confusing and chaotic place? Now, I'm sure that all of us have at least one question like that we would like to ask God. And some of us may have a lot of questions like that we would like to ask God. So if you have a burning question that you would like to put to God, then you will feel some kinship with Job. The book of Job is something of a theological drama. And here's how it begins. In Job 1, there is a conversation between God and Satan. And in this conversation, Satan isn't God's adversary, but Satan is sort of like God's servant. Satan is sort of like God's kind of prosecuting attorney. His job is to kind of roam around the world and find out what people are doing wrong, and then point that out. We learn right away that Job is what's called a blameless and upright man. He has a large family and great wealth. He's sort of like a Bill Gates of the ancient world. He is, in the Old Testament sense, a kind of iconic, righteous figure. He's pious, he's just, he fears the Lord, he's been blessed with a family and property and wealth and possessions. He seems to have it all. Until, as Satan comes back to report to God, the Satan says, well, I've been going about patrolling the world, finding out what people are doing wrong. And God says, well, did you notice my servant Job? He is a fine, upstanding, righteous, God-fearing man. Did you notice him? Almost with a sense of pride there. And the Satan, who's somewhat cynical, says, oh, well, of course he's righteous. Job's learned that righteousness pays. I'll bet that if you took away all his worldly goods, he would reject you in about 10 seconds flat. Because people are only interested in righteousness for what they can get out of it. That's the Satan's view. And then something happens that Job doesn't know about. The Satan is allowed to take away Job's family, his wealth, and even his health. So that as the drama begins, poor Job is sitting there, his family's been taken away, he's dirt poor, and he's sort of afflicted with this awful skin disease that produces these bumps and bleeding sores all over him. And then to make matters actually worse, His wife there is sitting beside him, and she's become something of a cynic too. And his wife's sage advice to him is, curse God and die. Isn't that cheery? Then, in Job 3-37, we have a long dialogue between Job and 4 friends. I'll explain why I'm saying friends here in a minute. The friends' names are Bildad, Eliphaz, Zophar, and Elihu. And when they find out what's happened to Job, they come to comfort him. These are the kind of comforters that you don't want. Because from chapter 3-37, they say over and over and over again. Now, Job, we know that righteous people always prosper, and the wicked are always punished. So, the fact that you're suffering means that you're a wicked man. And they just say this over and over and over and over, and nothing seems to be able to change their minds. But of course, we know, right, that Job isn't wicked. And he's not being punished. He really is a righteous man. In the person of Job, we see an innocent person who is suffering. Now, anyone who's read the whole book of Job will have some sympathy for him. He keeps protesting his innocence. And his friends keep coming back with their same old line, and they just kind of repeat it over and over and over and over. And Job says again and again and again, if I could just talk to God, He would vindicate me. If I could just present my situation and my case to God, God would certainly vindicate me, because I know that God is just. But here's the problem. Until chapter 38, the reading that we had for this morning, God is completely silent. He says nothing. Now, before going on with the drama of Job, I want to stop and make another point here. Early Christian interpreters of Job saw in the figure of Job a figure of Christ. Job is a righteous man who is suffering unjustly. He's accused of being a sinner by everyone around him. And in the face of all this accusation, God appears to be silent. So think with me for a minute. Think about Jesus on the cross on Good Friday. A truly righteous man, in fact the only righteous man, is on the cross suffering. Those around him are making fun of him. Ha 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 ha, if you're really the Messiah, God will be getting you out of this mess. And as the suffering and agony drag on, as the taunts and the jeers go on Good Friday, God appears to be silent. And so the church fathers saw in the figure of Job a prefiguration of Christ. Now, the suffering of Jesus sheds a lot of light on our suffering. And as a matter of fact, I think that unless we look at our own suffering in light of the suffering of Jesus, we're going to ask all the wrong questions. The suffering of Jesus tells us that the innocent really do suffer unjustly. The suffering of Jesus demolishes the idea that the good always do well and that the evil somehow are always punished in this life. It doesn't work that way. The suffering of Jesus also helps us to see that sometimes God can appear to be silent in the face of human suffering. But Jesus' resurrection tells us something else. Jesus' resurrection tells us that God can be counted on, finally, to deliver the righteous. That our sense of God's silence is really only our sense. That in the resurrection of Jesus, God has spoken loudly and clearly about who He is and what He intends to do. Now back to the story of Job. In Job 38, God finally says something after a long, long period of silence. As a matter of fact, there's a sense in which Job has gone so long without hearing the voice of God, he's almost like Jesus in Mark's account of the crucifixion, where, remember, Jesus begins to talk the words of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where are you? What are you doing? I'm suffering. Listen up." In Job 38, God finally answers. But what happens is not what Job expects. God does not show up to answer Job's questions. We don't have a scene here where God and Job sort of, go off to Starbucks and sit down at a table and over a cup of coffee. God sort of like explains everything that's happened, and, Job leaves Starbucks happy because now all his questions have been answered. Instead of answering Job's questions, God asks Job a question of his own. And that question is this: "Excuse me, Mr. Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? Do you have understanding?" In effect, what God says to Job is this: "Job, let me ask you a question before we go any further with this conversation. Job, do you understand the universe?" And as Job is saying, "Well, when you put it that way, well, I guess the answer is no." And that's when God comes back and says, "Well, I do." What is God saying to Job? First of all, God is reminding Job of a really important fact. It's a fact I think that we often forget. God is the creator, and we are his creatures. God does not need us, but we desperately need him. God's the creator of all life, and we're the recipients of the life that he creates. And so, God tries to bring Job to a moment of wisdom, a really important moment. God tries to tell Job that the reason why he is not answering his questions is not because God is somehow like withholding information from Job, but that there is an answer to his questions, but the problem is that Job will not understand them. That's the point. And in the course of Job 38 to 39, which is God's speech to Job, something really important happens. There are some things that you and I will never understand. And when that moment comes, when we see God face to face, we will not have God figured out. We will never figure God out. That moment will never come. And that, says the book of Job, is the beginning of wisdom. In a really real way, the book of Job really isn't simply about suffering or evil, it's about something else. It's ultimately about what wisdom is all about. Wisdom is the recognition that you and I are finite creatures and that there are just some things that we will never, ever understand. We will never get to the point where we have God sort of like all figured out. We will never get to the point where God's sort of whole purpose will like be explained to us as if it were simply sort of like a problem in high school algebra. Oh, that's how you do it. No. God is not somehow like the NSA, collecting all sorts of information, withholding secrets from us, somehow in the idea that somehow this is all good for us. No. There are some things that will remain secret, not because we can't know them, but because we will remain incapable of understanding. The wise person knows that in the absence of knowledge, we have to trust. The wise person knows that in the absence of having everything figured out, you and I are in the position of having to trust God. That's essentially what faith is all about. God laid the foundations of the world. You and I weren't there when it happened. And that's how things stand. This is probably a really difficult idea to accept in our scientific culture. In our culture, we really believe, I think, that eventually, right, the sciences will have everything figured out and everything will finally be explained to us. And if this guy over here just gets the next research grant, then it's going to come. And while science is a really wonderful thing, and while scientific discoveries are really good, in the final analysis, there are some things that you and I simply will never understand. They will not be found out. I sometimes have the idea that God looks at sort of like atheistic scientists who are really sure that God not only does not exist, but can't exist, because there's no scientific proof for it. I sometimes think that God sort of looks at these people not really as offensive, but as slightly humorous, and perhaps even sad. They're sort of like the person who has never left their small little hometown and believes the city of Paris simply cannot exist because they've never seen it. Ha ha ha. There are some things that you and I will never understand. And we can react to those things in one of two ways. Either we can find the fact that we will never understand everything as somehow like threatening. Or we can see the fact that there are some things that we will never understand as a manifestation of the fact that the mind of God is vastly greater than our minds, and choose to trust in the goodness and wisdom of that mind. Those are the choices before us. And as we go through a life that is confusing and difficult and full of unanswered questions, may God give us the grace to trust in His wisdom and in His goodness. Amen.